The title of this next section is Comparative Perspectives on Changing Times from the UK and Beyond. And we've got three colleagues who will be speaking to us from different disciplinary perspectives under that broad heading. We've got Amir Paz Fuchs, who's a member of the Law Faculty of Sussex. So it's really nice to have you, Amir, at our social work event, representing that form of interdisciplinarity. We've got Jon Skone, who's a social worker who became a Director of Social Services in Wales, and will be speaking from that perspective, those perspectives. And we've got Janet Boddy, who's a colleague closer to home in education and social work, who was a psychologist? Is a psychologist. I kind of knew I'd get that
Once
wrong.
Psychologist, always a psychologist.
Once, yes, is a psychologist, amongst other things, working with us in the School of Education and Social Work.
Interdisciplinary psychologist.
This is very important to psychologists out there, describing themselves. And what we did was ask Amir and Jon and Janet just to prepare 15-minute presentations from their perspective on our broad topic today of social work in tough times, taking a global view. So we had voices from beyond England, having had a very powerful voice in Isabel from England. And we were going to kick off with Amir. Yep. You're very welcome.
Thank you very much.
So I'm going to do a timekeeping. So it's 5 minutes, 20 minutes, 1 minute, and a time out.
Thank you. All right, so as a lawyer, it's not my first time, as will be immediately apparent, talking to social workers, but as a lawyer, I always feel the need to apologize why I'm qualified to talk about social work, and I'm going to talk about social work practice in Israel. Why am I qualified to talk about social work practice in Israel? Probably not, but I am familiar with the work of social workers in Israel through a few avenues. Initially as a legal academic in Israel and an activist working on social and economic rights and access to welfare rights, I engaged with many social workers and learned a great deal from their experiences. As my involvement in the field grew, I ended up teaching core undergraduate and postgraduate option modules at the School of Social Work at Tel Aviv University. The former, the undergraduate, offered me an insight into the next generation of social workers in Israel, and the latter enabled me to engage with mature social workers, some of whom have been in the profession for over a decade or two. Finally, as relationships evolved and developed, I became increasingly involved in the Israeli social workers' struggle for a decent living, their own struggle for a decent living, on which I'll say more in what follows. It's obviously impossible to cover the social, economic, and political realities in Israel proper and Israel-Palestine in the time frame allotted, and no complaints. And I shall not even claim to do so, but I would like to give you a taste of the challenges that the social work profession encounters against those realities. A good place to start is the global definition of the social work profession. I'm not sure if this has been exposed before. I was teaching and I have to rush to teach, but so just to refresh our memory, social work is a practice-based profession, an academic discipline that promotes social change and development, social cohesion, and the empowerment and liberation of people. Principles of social justice, human rights, collective responsibility, and respect for diversities are central to social work. My basic argument is that in the current context, Israel's social work, as opposed to some Israeli social workers, will not live up to this general aim. Two main forces are in play. Joined together, they have been coined, not by myself, and forgive the historical reference, national capitalism. Let's start with capitalism. A few years after Mrs. Thatcher and Mr. Reagan did their waltz of destruction on the welfare state in their respective countries, a similar process began developing in Israel. To many, this was astounding, and to an extent much more dramatic than anything that happened in any other country. For while there was never a governing socialist ethos here or across the pond, that was, at least rhetorically, more on that in a moment, quite the case in Israel, which was ruled for the first 30 years by the Workers' Party of Israel. The unraveling of this edifice, and moreover the pace that it unraveled by the right-wing Likud party, was unparalleled. A series of swift privatizations and outsourcing initiatives changed the Israeli landscape. But while most of the focus was on the price received for the selling of this national industry, that telecommunication company, or the national airline, the real story, not under the spotlight, was a change in social welfare provision. From a country that prided itself as one of the most egalitarian amongst modern capitalist nations in the 1950s and 1960s, it now has the second lowest rate of support to families in need in the OECD, after Korea, by the way. The highest percentage of children living in poverty, 36%, and among Arab and ultra-Orthodox Jewish population, over 50% of households are in poverty. While these numbers are routinely discussed and thus relatively well known to most Israelis, they tend to forget that individuals who must deal with the ramifications of increased poverty, including physical, mental illness, domestic violence, child abuse, and the like, are the social workers. And yet it should not be surprising to note that the increase in needs was not met with the increase in resources. In fact, the case was quite the opposite. Social budgets were slashed, local councils were deprived of funds, redundancies were prevalent, and perhaps most significantly, the trend of outsourcing ushered in, taking the social work field by storm. Since privatization is one of my main areas of interest, I looked into the numbers. Was astounded to find that over 80% of welfare provision in local councils and in the Ministry of Welfare is outsourced, being done by private and often for-profit corporations. The result is disastrous for the social work profession. Removed from the ambit of collective agreements, privatized social workers have no job security, can be subject to renewable, part-time, temporary, zero-hour contracts, and are forced, because of these circumstances, to violate ethical and sometimes legal provisions. It has become somewhat of a macabre humor among social workers in Israel who reflect on their own situation and find that it's often not far removed from the situation of those under their care. While many persevere, their emotional and physical resources are dedicated to their own survival and to offering the best care to their clients under impossible conditions. Many others, excellent, ideologically driven, and socially aware social workers exit the profession, leaving it to those who are either less qualified or who have a significantly different motivation. And here I turn to the second element, that of nationalism. It's probably of no surprise here to anyone here that Israel has become increasingly nationalistic in its orientation over the past 2 decades. This change is visible at the government level, but also in daily interaction with the men and women on the street. Some of these men and women, actually predominantly women, are in fact social workers, as we see here in the audience. The collapse of the welfare state and the expansion of outsourcing and private provision of welfare brought with them a resurgence of traditional, faith-based, localized form of social work. To an extent, this is a retrograde move to 19th century community-based social work, just without the radical nature. In fact, it's quite the opposite of any radicalism or claim for universal justice. Many social workers of this new generation are Jewish women who come to address the social ills that are present in Jewish communities. This is probably a good place to mention that critical historians who study Israel would probably view this recent development as an extension of the shaky foundations of the Israeli welfare state. And you can see I agree. You see, it is somewhat misleading to claim that Israel was established on a socialist ethos, contrary to what I said in the opening, if that implies, as it should, universalist commitments. When Palestinian citizens of Israel were subject to deprivation of liberty from day one, were denied access to employment, to unions, denied access to land, indeed sometimes denied access to their own land. However, in the first few decades, the universalist language of welfare legislation, this is my bit of law, the universal language of welfare legislation was sufficiently binding to uphold at least some aspects of equal provision. With the devolvement of social work to local councils and with its privatization, that commitment to equal provision was thinned down to the point of extinction. Matters became even more extreme after 1967. I mentioned earlier that the Likud party slashed the Israeli welfare state. In fact, this is only part of the story. Israel has actually developed an incredibly impressive welfare state in the Israeli settlements in the West Bank and formerly in the Gaza Strip. There you will find fully staffed local councils, thriving welfare departments, an abundance of resources, full employment, much of it public employment, and no hint of the poverty that is bringing Israeli society to its knees. We're talking about Israeli Jewish settlements, of course, in occupied territories. Needless to say, the social workers who operate in the occupied territories, like almost all of Israeli settlers, do not view Palestinians living in neighborhoods just around them, including those living in dire poverty without running water and subject to severe deprivation of life and liberty, as their concern. I hope that I managed to convey that my intention here is not to mobilize yet another call for Israel bashing. Rather, hopefully, it is a much more subtle insight that the occupation also has an effect on the profession and the way it sees itself. If we return to the global definition, concepts that are within, including empowerment, liberation of people, social justice, and human rights, cannot be more remote from the daily consciousness of Israeli social workers, Jewish Israeli social workers, living and working in the occupied territories, or at the very least, and perhaps worse, these concepts receive a very different interpretation. But I cannot leave you, I see the faces, and I cannot leave you in such a despondent state. There are reasons for optimism, however light and slight. I can mention here two amazing groups of social workers who operate courageously, vocally, and against all odds to oppose these joint forces of Israel national capitalism. The first is Osim Shalom. Shalom is, as you probably know, peace. Osim is a double entendre. Osim means making, and it's also kind of an acronym for social workers. So it's making peace and social workers for peace. This group trains Jewish and Palestinian social workers as agents for change in their communities and facilitators in conflict situations. The second is Atidenu, Our Future, a group of privatized social workers who work to claw back the outsourcing of public services, including social services, thus struggling for their own employment conditions and their ability to provide better services, but also studying the disastrous consequences of privatization of social services in general and offering a coherent and informed alternative. A testament to their central role, Atidenu's central role in the formation of this alternative, is a widespread and prolonged, over 3-month strike that they led in early 2011, which preceded and perhaps even led to a massive social protest in Israel in the summer of 2011. The problem, as you may notice, is that each group, qua group, of course social workers may be on both, but each group, qua group, addresses only one half of the foundations of Israel national capitalism, thus either willfully ignoring the other half of the challenge or viewing it as overly ambitious to try to tackle both aspects at once. They may be right. In the meantime, these courageous, energetic, bright young women on both fronts see the forest and the trees. If there is room for optimism for social work in Israel, it is because of them. Thank you.
Our next exciting speech is from our speaker, Mr. Jon Skone. He's a social worker who became a director of the social services in Wales, and he would like to share with you about Welsh perspective on social work. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. Can you all hear me okay? Yes. You can tell I'm a social worker because I think I'm one of the 2 people wearing a tie. So I apologise for that. It's always a bit difficult following the sort of speakers we've had already, because if you saw my notes you'd see lots of changes. But we don't have a chief social worker in Wales, and it was particularly powerful listening to somebody who speaks to government from a social work perspective, as opposed to a director of social services trying to do the same thing. I'm also grateful for you talking about the global social work thing, because I can cut that out of my talk. It's a delight for me to be here today, because it's about 35 years since I was last on this campus. I was being interviewed for a place on the social work course, and I didn't get it. So I went back to Wales, which is where I came from, and I've never ventured out until today. And it's a particular delight coming back to see you all again as a director of social services. 12 and a half years. I couldn't resist it. And for the last 2.5, I was also a director in the health service, so I ran hospitals as well as community services and primary care, or at least I thought I did. And my first message for you today is simply never give up, because you don't know what the future is going to hold. Because I come from Wales, we like to tell you where we are. That's Europe, and that's Wales, all right? And that's a bigger picture of Wales. I'm going to talk a bit, if this doesn't wobble too much, I'm going to mention the Swansea area. I'm going to talk a bit about the miners' strike. And where I live is there. Okay? So that's about 300 miles away from here. Okay. We have a population of around about 3.25 million people. We spend £1.4 billion from government funds on social services or social care. We employ just under 70,000 people, and we support about 5% of our population. That's 150,000 people. Isabel talked about the number of people who are registered as social workers, and in Wales that's just over 6,000. I must admit that strikes me as rather a lot. A lot of people are like me. I'm a registered social worker, but they don't let me anywhere near real people. In 1996 we had local government reorganisation, which was quite important because we ended up going from 8 county councils to 22 unitary authorities. And one of the issues in Wales is whether some of those authorities became too small. So the county I worked in, Pembrokeshire, had a population of around about 115,000 people. And the talk now is to have another reorganisation. They don't want to use the term reorganisation, where we'd go to 12. And in 1997 we had the Welsh Assembly government. It's gone under a number of different titles, but we have our own government. And just picking up on some of the things which were said earlier, our current Minister for Health and Social Services was a professor of social work. He spends most of his time trying to sort out the health service, but that's what his background was. And the commissioning, the comment on commissioning, a previous minister actually famously banned the use of the word commissioning in health and social services. It wasn't such a problem for us in social services, but it really blew the minds of commissioners in the health service because they didn't know what to call themselves. Why am I going to mention the miners' strike? One reason is that it's the anniversary, 30 years ago the miners' strike started, and it was a really important experience for those of us who are social workers, in my case, in the Neath Valley. Now the Neath Valley is, remember I showed you where Swansea is? The Neath Valley is north of that. Now these communities were almost everybody worked or had a connection with the mines. And they are small communities. Average size, a couple of thousand people. And everybody knew everybody else. And any problems they had, they tended to want to deal with them themselves. They certainly knew about them. But as social workers, we were actively involved with them. And we were actively involved in, I'll use the term, the struggle that was happening back in 1984. And I was reminded by my wife that we actually gave up a proportion of our pay as social workers to go into the support funds. When that strike finished, the communities were devastated. They moved from being almost in full employment to almost no employment whatsoever. And although there has been a change in the last 30 years, not a lot. You go into some of the communities in South Wales, they're still very, very down. And I have a question, I don't know the answer to this, but I wonder, somebody was talking, I think it was your good selves, about whether social workers would still be as politically involved and allow people to do things and all the rest of it. Well, I raised the same question. I wonder if today we had a miners' strike, whether the social workers of South Wales would react in quite the same way. Now, social work is not the same as social services. And I think that's an important point, because the theme of what I want to say is that this is not about reforming social work. This is about reforming social services in Wales. And there's lots of documents, and if you want to read these, I would recommend them. The first was in 2005, written by a colleague of mine, called Social Work in Wales, a Profession to Value. And that was the first time that we actually got people's views together to give a message about what we had done to the social work profession. I don't need to tell you a lot about that. You've heard a lot from Isabel and others about how we created systems that made it almost impossible to spend any time with direct client contact. And I was as guilty of that as anybody else. In 2007, the Welsh Government produced a document, a 10-year strategy. We're into our 10-year strategies in Wales. Unfortunately, our collective memory is about 3, so we keep on having them. But this is important because it's called Fulfilled Lives, Supportive Communities. Now, that is a social work title if I ever saw one. That didn't come from government, that came from the profession, because that is what we're about. And we started to see that shift. In 2011, we had another Welsh Government document called Sustainable Social Services for Wales that really did start to talk about the role of social work in solving some of the problems in social services, particularly working with people to find their own solutions as opposed to, and the cynics may say this is a cost-cutting exercise, solutions that aren't ongoing and costly. Does that make sense? But there were some important messages in there which I'll come to. And that has led to a bill that hasn't actually been ratified yet, but we can make our own law, and we have the 2013 Social Services and Wellbeing Wales Bill, not England or anywhere else. I'm not too nationalistic. And what's important, as I said, is that social work is recognised as being a fundamental part. It actually says that in the 2011 document. But, and this may reflect some of the difference between our two countries, I'll have to really speed up, we're not going for the National College of Social Work for Wales. We haven't adopted that. In the paper, it actually says we know that social workers are not simply the deliverers of predetermined care. So we are going to make a real effort to move away from the tick box mentality. We're committed to a co-production approach, and we recognise that we need to relearn skills and approaches. We have a long history, we believe, of citizen-centred services, and these are just some examples. But we had the first Commissioner for Older People in Wales, and that role and the Children's Commissioner really do have teeth. They could tell people like me to change what I was doing. We do believe in personalisation, but we do believe it's, and this is a direct quote, that it's closely associated with market-led model of consumer choice. So that's a clear difference in Wales. But we do want to adopt an approach to stronger citizen control. Within the 2011 document, these are the principles that government is following. I won't go through them, but they are social work principles. But at the end, there's also the professional aspect. So it's recognising that to deliver this is a professional social work function. This is a very, very clear and public distancing of the Welsh Government from the English Government on personalisation. So we have direct payment, but we're not doing the other things that you're doing in England. So finally, the role of social work in reforming social services has been recognised in Wales. The need for changes in policies and practice have been recognised. And the market-led model for consumer choice has been rejected. And I'll finish on this, so you don't need to show me the 1-minute one, you're okay. Because as a director, I don't like the pressure. I didn't know whether to do this, but I'll give it a go. Firstly, beware of politicians. No politicians in here, I hope. That's because they can't help themselves. They've always got to do things and change things, even when it's working. And you're seeing that if you look at the 2013 draft bill. they're going for centralising the adoption service. Now, that isn't the same as arguing that adoption shouldn't be reformed. I'm an adopted person myself, and it takes too long. I know that. But centralisation control is not necessarily a good thing for us. And they're very clear about intervention. They're looking at almost any excuse to intervene in local government and social services, and it's become flavour of the month in Wales. Inspectors, I love them, they're wonderful people, and I do agree that regulation is important. But beware of inspectors, because they're not always the most flexible people around. And what we're talking about here is a flexible approach to social work, and some of them find that quite difficult. Professional arrogance, this is where I get into dangerous ground, but you know, it's us. Actually, sometimes we can be our own worst enemies. We can really upset people by pushing too hard. Just look at other professions. So learn from that, because we do, as Isabel said, we do need to promote social work and the professionalism, but let's not be too precious about it either. Thank you.
Our reader from the department and from School of Education and Social Work. She's going to tell us about learning from differences, European perspective on social work in child and family services. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. And thank you very much. As Barry said, I'm a slight outsider here, like Amir, because my background's originally in psychology, and I came into this field of research really because I was interested in upbringing of children in state care, having done research about parenting and families previously. And that's led me into a whole series of studies over about the last 15 years about services for children and families in different European countries. That research hasn't specifically been about social work, but obviously, as Jon said, social work is part of services for children and families in this country and in other countries. So I think for me, and especially looking at social work from that kind of naive perspective, if you like, of somebody sitting outside the profession and looking at what social workers do, I think that European work is illuminating and thinking how social work sits within those other services and those policy structures for children and families in different European countries. So I'll draw on 3 studies in particular. Although these studies are building on research that I've been involved with over the last 15 years, including studies of social pedagogy that were led by Pat Petrie at the Institute of Education in London. And what I want to do today, 15 minutes isn't long to cover 3 studies and about 10 years of research. And I'm going to try and not take advantage of being on last and be obedient to Lisa's science. So I won't go into the methodology of these studies, but just briefly to say that all 3 of them involved country reviews, which were written by expert partners, people with in-country knowledge of the countries we were studying with. The Edges of Care study also involved fieldwork, actually over 100 interviews in that study, as well as the country reviews, which those of you who know my background in psychology, I've clearly never quite learned to be a qualitative researcher. I don't get the number of interviews down. And the Beyond Contact study involved country reports along with stakeholder interviews and seminars. And I think one of the things that's really important to highlight with this is the different partners that were involved, and their role, as I'll come on to discuss, really is crucial when you're doing this kind of research, so that you're not naive about what you're learning, what you're seeing in different countries. So, why do we do cross-national research? And the joke that I always make about this is that, well, it's lovely to be in Paris in the springtime or Berlin in the fall. It's not only that, although it is lovely and it's a great privilege to do this kind of work, But what this kind of research, I think, can do is offer one way of moving from rhetoric to make that a shift from ideas to concrete change. And cross-national research, I think, offers a particularly useful way of doing that. And it's against that background that the research I'm talking about has been commissioned to inform the development and the implementation of policy agendas. And that means it's not simply transplanting programs or services from other countries to ours. It's not simply, as I've sometimes been asked, can you tell us how to teach people to do social pedagogy on the children in this residential home? It's not about that. What it's really about is thinking about what's possible, generating ideas, and I like this idea of looking with fresh eyes, and in a way, in that context, the fact that I'm not a social work professional, that I bring that outsider perspective as well as the outsider perspective of going into other countries, that means that I can ask the naive questions that really, I and my colleagues, that really challenge the taken for granted. Bastow and Wilford in 2001 talked about questioning the historical inevitability of existing practices. And I think that's very relevant to what Isabel was saying earlier about thinking about practice systems. I'll come back to that point. But I think it's also important, thinking about Paris in the springtime, that we don't idealise when we do cross-national research. We're not doing this research in order to identify which country is best and to learn how to do what they do. And that's why the expert partners play such an important role, because they bring the critical perspective of the insider as I'm asking the questions of the outsider. The other thing that I think is really important in this is that cross-national research is never comparing like with like. And I always hesitate to talk about this kind of research as being actually comparative. I talk about parallel country case studies. And the research that Imogen mentioned before is actually specifically focused on that. It's a study in India and the UK, two countries which are deliberately vastly different, to challenge these very assumptions that we make about what's translatable. And so if you think, I don't expect you to kind of see the detail of this, but this is just highlighting some European data on some of those contextual differences in the countries where we've done research. And if you look at some of those things, like the Danish percentage of GDP that targets children and families, it's 4.5% compared to less than 2% in the UK. It's very easy to look at those kinds of figures or the differences in child poverty and say, oh, well, you know, there's no point in looking at Denmark because everything's easy there. They spend the money, they pay the tax, they don't have the social issues that we're concerned about. That's true. It's partly why it's important that we look at a mix of countries, as we've done. This is the mainstream parenting support study, these countries. But I want to give you another point of comparison there between the UK and the US. And you know, in this country we're terribly keen on importing parenting programs and other interventions from the US. And I like to show these figures when I talk to people within DFE or policy about what you can learn from doing European research. Yes, we're very different from Denmark. Yes, we're very different from the US. But so long as we're conscious of difference, so long as we're thinking about what we can learn, thinking about what's possible, we can learn from countries. We can learn between countries with very different population contexts, with very different welfare models. And I think this is partly about language. The US literature is very accessible to us in a way that the Danish literature is not, or the French literature even. But I think also that very lack of a language barrier means that we don't see differences in a way that we have to when we're translating concepts across languages. So there's a concept in Danish social pedagogy, for example, called rummelhed, and it kind of means roominess, which kind of relates to psychoanalytic concepts, but it actually means something different within a social pedagogic theoretical frame. So you can't just translate that word without having a conversation about the ideas behind it. And I think that's one of the things that's so helpful about working across languages, is that it really drills you down into what the concepts are. But I think the other thing that's important is that we don't get too caught up on difference. Our research has found commonalities and differences across all the countries that we've studied. And I really liked this advice from a manager in a Dutch NGO who we spoke to a couple of years ago. And he said, well, you know, this is all very interesting when we sit and talk about the common problems across countries. He was talking about the difficulties of working with families who've looked after children. But it's more important to know how you find solutions. It's more important to look at ways forward. And I think that speaks as well to that challenge that Isabel posed. So we see familiar concerns, which of course include austerity. But the fact that we have familiar concerns across these countries, I think again reinforces the fact that there's potential for shared learning there. One of the concerns which has been talked about a lot across these studies is this question about the accessibility of support. And for me, that brings us to one of the really important areas of differentiation when we look across countries, when we talk about understandings of rights. And I don't have time to go into detail on this, but just to illustrate it really quickly. So within German law, the Child and Youth Welfare Act specifies that young people have a right to help with upbringing. They have that right in law. That spans youth work, that spans family support, that spans placement. All of that is conceptually connected as a right to help with upbringing that young people have within German society. And these kinds of rights have a historical basis, which you can see in these countries in their constitutions. And I think one of the interesting contrasts that you don't really think about until you start to work cross-nationally is that the UK is actually quite unusual in having no formal constitution and in having arguably no explicit family policy. You could argue that the children's plan that Ed Balls developed was the closest that we've come to having an explicit overarching family policy. That was very quickly dismantled after the change of government and very publicly marked by the name change from DCSF, Department of Children, Schools and Families, back to Department for Education. One of the other key points that we see, and this is just an example from Denmark, is of a conceptual continuity between universal and targeted services. So that idea of help with upbringing in the German Child and Youth Welfare Act is one part. The Danish is strengt principle, which means the continuity principle is part of that. And within that, in principle, every Danish citizen linked to their identity number has a social worker, in the way that we all have GPs linked to our NHS number in England. So you may never see your social worker, but it's your right as a citizen to have one, starting from a very, very different place. What that also depends on is having a professionalised workforce, and just very briefly what we see within this, and this is a contrast with England, and of course there are differences between the other countries, but this is a strong common theme, is that you see a workforce which is in general more highly professionalised, with at least degree level qualifications or higher. And social work sits within that professionalised workforce, in contrast to a context here where aspects of work like early childhood services, like family support, are very often done by staff with lower qualifications. In other countries, they're done within professionally differentiated teams, which might include social pedagogues, but also psychologists, lawyers, health professionals working alongside social workers. And that relates to this point from a civil servant that we interviewed on the Edges of Care study. And I think Isabel actually made this point as well, that we have this very high responsibility for the whole life of the child, and that needs people very well educated. So we see a professionalised and professionally differentiated workforce, which includes social work, but doesn't expect social work to do it all. And for me, that's one of the really striking differences. As I said, coming to UK social work or English social work really as an outsider, and thinking, you know, I'm on tape, aren't I? So I won't use the words that spring to mind. But my goodness, don't we expect a lot of social work in the UK? And June Statham and I wrote about this in 2009 at the time of the Social Work Task Force that Isabel mentioned. And I think this question really still stands today. So I started by talking about questioning the inevitability of our taken for granted practices. And I wanted to end by just doing that. Maybe the problem with social work is not social work, but it's what, as society, we expect social workers to do. Thank you.